I am a licensed clinical psychotherapist, and I specialize in the field of sexuality, which just means that I went to a postgrad and got a specializes, if any, in anything that has to do with human sexuality. I think as sex therapists, we look at sexual well-being from an emotional, psychological, and physical standpoint. And we really, kind of study anything that has to do with sexual well-being, dysfunctions, enhancement of pleasure, but anything that has to do with human sexuality. A lot of the times I get cases that are sex therapy cases, and people kind of come in thinking, okay, I just need to talk about sex. But when we start to really unpack everything that's connected to sex, people are really surprised by it. One of the analogies that I use, and this is the work of Emily Nagoski, she's a sex researcher and she's amazing, but she talks about this garden. And what I always say is that we all have an erotic garden. And by the time that we become sexual and we start to be interested in relationships, when we look at a little garden, we realize that there's been so many plants or seeds planted in our garden without our awareness, right? Messages about sex, culture, religion, sex being good or bad. So even though sex is everywhere, I don't think that many people have a good understanding in how all of these components come together when it comes to sex and intimacy, right? Because if I'm working with a couple and they say, okay, this is a sex therapy case, we got to talk about communication. We got to talk about how do you learn that sex was important to you? How do you learn to prioritize sex? So even though we see it that way, I think that it's lacking because even though sex is everywhere, we don't really talk about it enough, I think.
Why do you think we're so uncomfortable with talking about sex when it is intertwined with so many aspects of who we are as human beings?
Yes, well, I think, it's been a taboo topic. I think culture and religion have a lot to do with that as well. Me, I'm Colombian, growing up in a machista culture where as a woman you're told that you have to quiet down your sexuality, but then when you get older and now you're going to get married and you better have sex with your husband, otherwise it's going to change you for a younger model. These are very confusing messages. Lack of education, even in the United States, we don't have good sex education in our schools. This abstinence only model hasn't worked ever, right? And yet we continue to do it. Kids nowadays can go on the internet, put porn and sex, and they have so much information that has nothing to do with good sex education. I think parents sometimes are afraid. There's this fear, if I talk to my kid about sex, are they going to want to have it more? Which every study known actually presents the information contrary to that belief. So I think that there's many variables in our history, right? Like we've kind of defined sex as good, bad, clean, dirty, and we're still unfortunately dealing with some of those ideas and concepts.
What do you think would be a more appropriate model for education around sexuality, especially for adolescents that you mentioned? Because you're right. I do think a lot of people have those fears of if I talk too much about sex, my kids are just going to have more sex. But I've also seen the studies that you're referencing, and kids that had more information about sex actually were having way less sex because it almost took away too the exciting taboo, which could push people into having more sex.
Yes, they were having sex at a later age, less teen pregnancies. I think three words come to mind when you ask me that question: normalizing, right? Consent and pleasure, right? So if we could teach sexuality, first of all, normalizing, and I know that we're talking about adolescence, but even when we're young, right? Like if I'm twirling my hair and something about twirling my hair feels good, but mom says, don't do that, that's bad, then for me, that's a really confusing message. There are studies that when babies are in the womb, they're kind of touching, of course, they don't know that this is masturbation, but there's something about that that feels good. So why is one body part different than the other? And I think, there's been studies when adolescents, especially, they're kind of like begging and pleading, we need more relevant sex education because we don't teach them about sex, yet there's so much information out there, right? Like, so for me, it's talking about pleasure and consent. I work with men that are now in their 40s that are like, oh my God, Paola, I think when I was in college, I don't know if that was a fully consensual relationship, and I didn't have the information that I have now today. And when I talk about pleasure, Ty, is really beginning by understanding, what feels good in my body, right? Like, how do I learn to explore with myself? I talk about solo sex, which is really exploration, understanding what type of pleasure I enjoy, because this is not only going to help you to protect you against sexual traumas, understanding when a no is a no, and also to ask for what you want in long-term relationships.
You just touched on so many important topics because in our society, and obviously us being from Live Jasmine, we see this a lot where our models are very stigmatized. And because this is a group of predominantly women, a lot of times, who have in many ways taken control of who they are as sexual beings, and they are helping to liberate other people and to help them explore their pleasure and explore who they are as sexual beings. But I've also talked to members who, one of the main reasons they come to Live Jasmine is because it's a space where they're allowed to talk about sex openly.
I'm thinking about fantasies, I'm thinking about fetishes, sometimes camming or in Live Jasmine, where you can really talk about a fetish in a way that's normalized. So here we're going back to that idea of being normalized, and that I'm not good or bad, that this is just something that brings me pleasure and curiosity and arousal. And I think all human beings, we want to be seen, we want to be wanted, but most importantly, we want to feel understood. And when somebody, and curiosity is kind of like the gateway that takes you there, right? Like, so when you have someone that's taking interest in what it is that you're bringing in, that just, there's so many emotional things that are happening. The partner where somebody shares a fantasy and they're like, oh, how could you? What's wrong with you? Right? Like, we want to really understand that there's something coming up for them. Remember how we talked about the little garden? So this person's garden probably has some seeds planted in there out of fear that if you fantasize about someone, that it means that you're cheating or you're not good enough. So it's important for people to know that, because in relationships, communication is a way in which we connect to each other. It's a way where sex gets better. And so whenever I hear that word hardening, for me, that brings up the emotion of shame.
Yeah, I think you really hit the head on the nail that this has a lot to do with shame. I also feel like it's spoken in some cases, but it's also unspoken. People just don't have permission to even explore themselves sexually, to even really dive into their pleasure. We seem to have this collective disdain for pleasure. We don't want people to have pleasure, I guess. But I would like to take this opportunity in this interview to talk about why it's important for us to explore ourselves sexually. Why is it important to explore our pleasure? What benefits does that bring into our life?
Yes, a beautiful question. So I want to start by talking a little bit about, because sometimes when people come in, one of the common presentations in couples is, One person really wants to be sexual, the other person doesn't. And one of the first questions that I ask, when do you have stop having erotic thoughts? And when I talk about erotic thoughts, yes, it could be about someone that you see, but it could be seeing a water fountain and something about that water reminds you of something, feeling a certain sensation. Auditory. It was really funny, through a pandemic, everybody's wearing masks, but I remember being at Publix, which is, Florida grocery store, and like there was somebody behind me, it was a man, and he had this really interesting voice. All he said was, "Excuse me," but I was like, "Oh." And I'm like, okay, I'm really auditory. I knew this about myself, but I'm like, oh, something in me is kind of awakening, and I hadn't even seen him. Right. So I think one is, paying attention. Attention is a vital component of connection, not only to other people, but yourself. So thinking a little bit about that. And then when it comes to pleasure, stepping out of the sexual part for a minute, how do you give yourself pleasure? Right? Eating that chocolate, or on Fridays, right? Like getting that Starbucks coffee that tastes delicious. How do you experience pleasure outside of the intimate and the sexual area? And then when it comes to pleasure, I mean, we all know that orgasm, right? It creates oxytocin. This is the love hormone, right? Like giving yourself an orgasm also helps, medically, physically, with sleep, with stress, you name it, right? But for me, understanding and knowing what feels good, oh my God, it also helps you understand what's not feeling good. So again, protecting yourself against experiences that are negative or can be traumatic, and also learning to ask for what you want. It empowers you, right? In a way that if I know what I want, I'm confident in asking for what that is. And sexual confidence, along with oysters, is one of the most reliable aphrodisiacs.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And, to that point, it's like in order to know what you want, you have to spend that time to get to know yourself. And what a fun opportunity to know yourself in a different way than what you're used to. Everyone always says, meditate on things, journal. Like it's so important to know your mind and your values and what you like. But that's also true for who you are as a sexual human.
Yes, and even when you say that, right? Like, because now we're tapping into imagination, curiosity. When we stop being curious, we fall into this really dark routine type of place, and we can all even call it self-care. Because when you were talking about what a beautiful opportunity to connect to yourself, any self-care activity is about connecting to yourself. We just mentioned the couple, right? So why don't we deserve the time? Why don't we deserve the time for play and pleasure? We all deserve the time for play and pleasure.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And anyone listening, that's your permission. We give you
Yes.
permission. Um, you said something else that I think is really interesting and important, which is that in order to really connect, you have to give attention. And I want to talk more about that because, obviously on Live Jasmine, we have a lot of members that will see one particular model. For years, I've interviewed members who have seen the same model for almost 20 years. And to me, obviously, that speaks of the fact that this model has given this person a need that they needed in their life. And many times it is tied to this undivided attention that happens when it's you and the model. And a lot of times, maybe members don't feel like anyone else in their day-to-day life is listening to them or caring about them or focused on them. But when they have this interaction, it becomes so powerful. I want to talk more about your thoughts on connection and attention and how they go together.
Yes, well, imagine. So one of the things that we know is that, and this is a quote from Goddess Amina, she's a sex educator, and she says that we have a whole world trying to pull us away from the now. So we have to really learn how to seduce ourselves back into the moment so that we can seduce ourselves back into our body. Right. And And when we think a little bit about that's amazing that I think imagine this 20-year relationship that people have with these models, because I think when you tune in, right, it is almost like the idea of what we would say when somebody's entering an intimate or sexual encounter. We are closing the door to deadlines, to what do I have to do? So to what am I, how, I'm stressed, financial issues. We're closing the door to everything else to tune in to one of, people assume that sex is a biological drive. Connection is actually a biological drive, right? And so when you talk about that idea of attention, and I think what's really interesting, especially for like Jasmine, is they're listening, but they're listening without judgment, right? The judgment piece is such a big part. I am listening and I am humanizing this experience. They know that whatever they bring in that day, right? Like that person is gonna be there for them. I was just reading some research on robots, and we predicted that the first that humans would be legally married to a robot in 2050, but it actually happened in 2017 in China. I don't know if you're familiar with Gay Box. I think it's called. And when you see the promotion for Gay Box, a lot of single men in China, right? Like this little robot wakes you up and texts you and says, when are you going to get home, or what would you like to eat? And it's going to rain today, so make sure you take your umbrella. The promotion commercial is actually really interesting. And so in 2021, China, made this legal. 2022, there was another man in Australia who also married a robot. So I think, there's something about connection and feeling seen and feeling wanted and feeling desired that comes through my practice, ties so much with individuals and with couples, right? Like, because validation and feeling validated and being seen by another is something that we never really outgrow.
I'm blown away by so much of what you just said. But to that idea of the robot, saying, have a good day and make sure you take your umbrella. And it's like this innate feeling so deeply cared for, because as you're talking, I'm imagining, okay, if I were getting messages like that, I would love it, actually. You know what I mean? I'm like, actually, that's really sweet. But again, because it's speaking to that part of us as human beings that want to be cared and nurtured and loved. you know, Obviously there's not a perfect world, but in many situations, a human being's first strong love is their mother. Not in every situation, but in many situations, that nurturing, that care, it's such an innate need for us, and maybe even more so for people who felt like they have lacked that in their lives.
Yes, absolutely. And to your point, I imagine there are people that have always had a very conflicted or dysfunctional relationship with their mother, and they're still chasing that love.
Yes.
Right. So I think that there's something so true about that. And yes, that the care for is tapping into, I think, a human need. We all need to feel connected one way or another.
What's really interesting to me here is, we're talking about someone who married a robot who was basically giving them what they perceive as love in some way or another, or giving them whatever their needs are. And then even looking at Live Jasmine, we're talking about people who are paying by the minute to interact when sexual content is free online. So we know it's beyond just sexual content. It's more, in my opinion, about the interaction and connecting, especially when you hear that model and member are having relationships that last 10, 15, 20 years. But I want to discuss this element of us being willing to pay for connection or marry a robot, something that's not human, that it's almost, my question to you would be, does it matter how we get the need met? Or does it not matter how we get the need met?
Well, I think that, what's beautiful about sexuality is that it's diverse, right? Like for some people, that may not work. I think so no, I think if there's a way that you feel connected, and the whole camming industry, I think, we all experienced it in the pandemic when people were doing Zoom parties and FaceTime, right? And I think the more senses we can use, the better, right? But I think where maybe the if I could call it transactional part of it is that sometimes we are not practicing rejection and uncertainty and awkwardness. And those are life skills that you need to really get good at, not only when it comes to relationships, but when it comes to a job, when it comes to life. Right. Like, so I think that would be my only thing. And that sometimes, we're kind of missing that touch. But again, going back to these people that are okay with marrying a robot because this is their preference, because this is what satisfies them, right? Like, if touch is not a need for that person, then there are certain things that are going to fit well, right? But I think that, there is the transactional aspect of it that is missing other elements that I think are important for real life face to face relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm curious if there's a recurrent block that you see in your patients when it comes to sexual well-being, and if there is, what it is.
So I would say, it's really interesting. I just did a little video talking about, okay, for women, right? Like, how do women that maybe have low libido, right? Like lack of desire, something that I work with a lot. What makes a difference? What makes it or break it, whether they develop a sexual dysfunction? So I think the block for women, and I would also say men, right, is that we, going back to the garden, that the make it or break it for women is beliefs around sexuality. If you learn that sex is an important part of the relationship, that is a priority for you and for your partner. But if you learn, well, when you age, sex is just not a thing, right? Like, it's more about companionship, or sex is bad or dirty. I think the blocks really come in the messages, in what's been planted in our garden. For men, if, again, what makes it or breaks it when they lose an erection. Super normal to lose an erection, opposed to the message that we've gotten that men are always ready and they always want sex, right? Like, some men, they need to be emotionally connected in order to be sexual with someone. And so if they're not connected, lose their erection. Oh my God, I'm a failure. The typical song and dance, I'm a failure, I'm not good enough, I'm failing you as a partner, right? Like, so performance anxiety. And that is one of the main blocks that I see for men, that, because we've taught them that they have to perform, that they have to provide, and that makes it or break it. Whether you say, okay, this happens, let me talk to my partner about it, let me wait and see if I can get aroused again, or what's wrong. So I think the blocks is really in the messages. One of the things that I often talk about is, guys, we need to go back to that garden and unplant the things that no longer serve you, the things that no longer make sense, so that you can start to plant the exotic flowers that you want to see in your garden.
Really well said. That's actually one of the reasons we've started this interview series, is because we do feel like a lot of the messaging around sex in many parts of the world, pretty much everywhere, is it's still not as accepting and clear and fluid as it should be. It's still very black or white, which is so damaging to people and their understanding of it, of who they are. And so one of our goals is to get more information out there from people like you, who are seeing clients, seeing patients. You've gone to schooling, you have, you know what I mean? You have a background to speak from a clear and holistic point of view. And based off of what you've seen with your patients, there may be some differences with someone else who has patients, but to have a myriad of perspectives out there with information that's real is our goal.
Oh my God. So exciting, because there's so much, especially, social media. I think it's been helpful in some ways, but it's like, if you show up with a vibrator, then you're gonna have better sex. So many variables to that. Does that person are they welcoming a vibrator? Is it about more enhancement to the sex, or is there something that's inhibiting having more sex, right? Like, so I think this is, I love that you guys are doing this, because this is part of creating a sex positive culture where we're talking about these things openly, and you are providing the information that is good information, that is educational in nature. So, so important.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely our goal.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any clients who have used a camming service or been part of one.
Yes, I work. Yes, I do. I think that there are ways, right? Like with the camming stuff again for my guys. I see it more in men. I don't see, I know that you guys also have, and I'm curious, whether women are also using the service, because I know that you have man models as well. I believe that women's sexuality needs more attention. But anyways, that's a topic for another day. But I think, yes, I think that it can be used in a healthy way. Again, when you have a fetish, when there's something, a fantasy that you really want to play out and you want to talk about it, I think that sometimes when it gets a little bit tricky, especially with couples, if the partner knows that this person is scamming and that hasn't been negotiated in the relationship, then that's something to talk about. But I think that it goes back to, and I always talk to my guys about, hey guys, let's use this as a resource, right? Like, because for some people it may be enough, but sometimes it's like, oh well, I feel really safe here. But then we're not getting to practice again the rejection, the awkwardness, other things that may be important when it comes to real time, face to face relationships. But yes, I do have clients that use scamming, sex workers, all of the above.
You said something that actually really stood out to me, which I have seen to be true, which is that women's sexuality isn't necessarily getting the attention that it needs right now. Because you're right, it's really interesting the world we're living in, where I think that part of the reason, and I've had some male members tell me this, that they love using Live Jasmine so much is they're actually getting therapeutic benefits. So they talk to the models about, everyday life, about their problems, and they have someone who's non-biased in listening to them. Many of these members might feel uncomfortable going to traditional therapy because of the societal stigma and what that means as being a man and going to therapy, right? And on the flip side of that, there are many women, there are women on Live Jasmine, but I think they feel the need to hide it the most because of what that means by societal norms. If you're using a cam site and exploring sexuality in a visual way and in that way, and sex work, there's stigma and judgment really harshly towards women who would go after it in that way. So I see how both sides are almost having to hide what their needs are because of the societal pressure around it.
Yes, yes. And I think we're still dealing with that. But Sally, when you were talking earlier, I thought that, just came back to me when we were talking a little bit about rights and this talk about this black and white mentality. Fear sells. Be afraid if, and this little snippets of information that there was this person, for example, the trans community that, went through gender affirming surgery and then they regretted it. And this goes viral. And now people make it, oh no, you can't because this happened. It's one case out of like, I don't even know how many, right? Like, so I think fear sells, right? And when it comes to women's sexuality, we still have to do so much work. Imagine, as I was preparing for this talk, I wanted to look that up. I was looking a couple of things up, but at some point, the clitoris was not even in medical books. First, it was believed that in order for you to conceive, you had to have an orgasm. So fabulous, everybody's loving it. Women are loving it. Men are focusing on women's pleasure. Then the clitoris disappears from medical books. And then Sigmund Freud says that, only mature women can have an orgasm through penetration, like, which we know that a lot of women don't have orgasms through penetration, is more through clitoral stimulation. Only 25% of women, that's the norm, orgasms through penetration. So, there's just so much more work to be done. And I think when it comes to men being able to talk to the girl, the models in Life Jasmine, and really being able to have this, that's a start, right? Like if they want to develop some of the ideas that maybe they discover in Life Jasmine through a therapeutic approach, then being open to that. But I see that changing, and I don't know if it's where I am. I'm in Miami, right? Like I'm a sex therapist, but I see a lot of men in my practice, which I'm so excited about, because we're breaking from that stigma, that I can do it myself. It is really exciting to see, and I really love working with men.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's really good to hear. On the flip side of that, regarding women, what are some of the issues you're seeing in regards to women's sexuality? Do you feel like we're progressing, or what are your thoughts?
So the one thing that I see repeatedly, because I think historically women were nurturers, caretakers, that sometimes it is the one thing that I see, that it is so hard for them to ask for what they want in sex. So then they end up in the gynecologist. Unfortunately, gynecologists are great, but they're not really trained too much in sexuality or sex therapy. So it's like, I don't really know what to do with this. Most of the time, low libido, lack of desire. And a lot of the time is that women are not having sex worth wanting, right? So it's like, okay, this routine sex. And I don't know if it's because of the messages, right? Like for women, it's like, oh, when you get married, the wedding, and it's very fantasy and idealized. For men, is the ball and chain. So do men get more comfortable when they get married? And do women get bored with the sex that they're having faster? Right. So I think for women is being able to feel empowered. We've done such a good job in kind of empowering ourselves in so many ways. But the common thing that I hear, well, I don't want to tell him because I'm going to hurt her feelings or his feelings or their feelings. Well, I'm not really sure, because what if I'm just going to withstand the pain, or this is almost over, so I'm just going to sit here and wait for it to finish. And that creates a negative association with the sexual experience,
So
right? And then exploring, right? Like in culture, I love, I'm in Miami, therefore I see so many different cultures, which is really exciting. But culture, right? Like I remember going to a wedding in Colombia, and when people find out that I'm a sex therapist, they end up, I end up being the popular person of the group, because everybody was asking questions. And women, maybe like in their 30s, asking me whether using a vibrator when you're in a committed relationship is okay. I was a little taken back, because I'm like, ladies, we gotta, right? But men, also the culture, especially some Latino men, where they're like, oh well, why do you want to bring in an adult toy or a toy? Am I not doing enough? And when we talk about toys, remember they're enhancers, they're not replacements. But I think that that is the common thing that I see, not being able to ask for what we want and saying no to the things that we don't.
it's so true. It's so true. And I know so many women who are married and sex has been reduced to them as just a duty, like to keep him happy. They're not even really focused on their own pleasure, like we talked about before. It's more of a, okay, well, let me keep things between us good. And so focus on that. They're not
Yes.
in it for themselves, but they are sexual beings, you know?
Yes, Ty, and you said the beautiful word, because before we can be focused on pleasure, we gotta be focused, period.
Mm.
Right? Like this idea of paying attention to what, ooh, when we have hormonal changes, right? Like, and it's funny, I'm like, there are times in the month where I'm like a teenage boy. I'm like, opera, you got it, you and you, but it's like, okay, I'm feeling all these things in my body, because you have to be able to pay attention, right? And we can be task oriented, having children for many women. It's like a child literally depends on you to stay alive, right? Like, so task oriented, the do, and yes, the duty or the chore. Many women say that's just a thing on my list: pick up the kids, make dinner, have sex with my husband. And for the husbands, are you noticing, are you paying enough attention? Whether she's just sitting there going for the ride, or whether she's really connected to the experience. Very important for them to think about that too.
Absolutely. There is a huge distinction between true connection and routine, just like an automated thing. Honestly, at that point, when it's just like automated, there are probably robots at this point that can give you more than an automated.
Exactly,
At this
exactly. And
point.
yes, and that's how people end up here, right? Because it's what we call scripted sex. It gets the job done. I can cross it off the list, but then they look at each other. This happened a lot in the pandemic because I think when something like the pandemic happens, psychologically, when we're faced with our own mortality, we ask, is this it? And am I living a life worth living? So eventually, after scripted sex, we look at each other and we're like, is this all there is? So this is when you hear people say, we don't have any passion, or I love them, but I'm not in love with them. It's because the scripted sex gets the job done, but it gets boring. If I eat, I love sushi, but if I eat sushi every day, I'm sure that I'm going to be like, all right, I think I'm done. Right. So I think it's realizing how scripted sex really starts to work against you, even though it gets the job done.
I have to say, I think too, that's part of the reason platforms like Live Jasmine have become so popular because when you like, in order to make that experience worth it, you have to be communicating your needs. And then that model has to be taking that in and giving you what. So there's already this conversation that's happening that I think, from what I've heard, many couples, like they're having the scripted sex, but they're not actually talking about sex and what they want and what could improve it, or being vulnerable in that way. And so that loses a lot of the connection. Whereas if there's a member or someone who's in a situation like that, and then he finds out that there's this model who's now giving him that connection and attention, I can see how in those cases they just keep returning and returning and returning to the model. And like you mentioned before, sometimes that hasn't been negotiated with their partner, which can potentially be problematic.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, and I think to everything you asked me earlier, about this idea of the emotional component, there's such an emotional component. Even when we think about group sex, when people fantasize about group sex, threesomes, right? Like it's being wanted by more than one person, right? So I think, how do we create that bridge? Because I think the closer we are, the more afraid we are that we're going to hurt each other, that we are going to get them upset or mad, and that keeps you from really communicating your needs. And for the people listening, what I always suggest is talk about the sex that you want, not when you're in the middle of it, right? Unless something is hurting, or less, but like, let's explore again, give it the attention that it needs, right? Let's talk about, or even after a sexual experience, hey, I really like that, or hey, I didn't really like that. I like to play the traffic light, right? Like, okay, is this a green, is this a yellow, or is this a red for you? Green meaning you don't even have to ask, love it, do it, right? Yellow, I'm intrigued, I'm curious, but you may have to ask whether I want to move forward or not. Red, right now, this is just not negotiable, right? And so there's so many creative ways to talk about sexuality, and I think Life Jasmine is a good way for us to be able, okay, I said it, okay, oh, good reaction. Okay, I'm going to say it again. I think the problem again comes when it's not negotiated enough in the relationship, and that can become an issue. But this is the non-judgmental piece of it, is the acceptance, right? When we have understanding and acceptance, that is the antidote to shame. Shame does not survive when there is understanding and acceptance.
So true. So true. And that those things, those very things, understanding acceptance is such a driving core desire for human beings, to the point where a lot of times people will betray themselves to stay in the good graces or acceptance of other people. We deeply desire acceptance, but I think the most healing acceptance is when we're being accepted for who we truly are, and all of us, and not just who we're pretending to be.
Yes, and it may feel safer to be able to do that with someone like that is part of Life Jasmine, right? Because here I am showing as my true self, and I think it's a good way to start to get familiar with that true self, right? And how can you bring that out in other concepts, in other parts of your life? How could we continue to create those bridges?
On Jasmine, we actually have a very large model population from Colombia. And
Mm.
I've interviewed some of the models, and what they've told me is that it's shifting in a way where now modeling is becoming like a cool job, which is interesting. I'm curious your thoughts on that. And it's, because they're able to make such a high quality life and living for themselves that they're providing for their entire families, that now they're starting to get familial support for it. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that, if you had heard that or.
Yeah, well, I think it's safe, right? But I do, and I think that there is, I think it could also be empowering, right? It's a way to, the person is in control, right? Like I do believe, though, Ty, one of the things that I offer that I'm really passionate about is working with people in the field of camming, any type of sex work, because whenever you're working with people, your energy, right, like you're giving a lot of energy, and most men can be really, right, like respectful, but when you're paying for a service, there that transactional piece, right, like it can get a little bit tricky. But yeah, I think that it's safe, it's empowering, right? Like I think statistically, what was it, 2019, I think there were 7 million users. In 2021 there were 107 million users when it came to camming and OnlyFans. I think the pandemic really made this, because we need connection. Humans are cannot live on their own, right? Like, and so I think that really made this camming industry really grow. But yeah, I can see that it's such an opportunity, especially in our countries, that sometimes it can be tough, right? And so it's a way of making a living, right? Without having to put yourself in danger, without having to, right, like maybe sacrifice the time with your children, having flexible schedules. There's many benefits, I believe, to the camming industry.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because Colombian models do, like, they're some of the top models. They do very well. And my personal thoughts on part of that is there's certain cultural norms that do very well for people that are coming to the site for connection. There's a natural warmth to them. Obviously, there's many of them are just absolutely gorgeous, and just that personable warmth and sensuality. It's something it's hard to even put into words, but I know what that is. And they
Yes.
do very well. So when you were saying, it's empowering to be like, you know what, I'm naturally this way. These are the attributes that people are looking for when they're looking for connection, and taking control of that. I can see why a lot of the girls I've interviewed that are in Colombia are enjoying it. And they're like, this is the hot job right now.
Yes, and that's so interesting, Tara, because I could imagine, because in a way, like a lot of Colombian women, like this caretaking, this nurturing, submissive in a good way, and then at the same time, we're like kind of putting the machista culture on their head, because it's like, now I get to do this and I get to make a living, and who's gonna say what,
Yeah.
right? So that's really interesting. Yes, there's that warmth that you go to Colombia and everybody is just, there's a different type of feeling. It's the culture definitely piece. I can see how they're doing really well. Good job, Colombians.
Yes, yes, they are. Yeah. I'm curious if there's anything about human connection, human sexuality, your work that we haven't talked about, but you want to share.
What do I want to share? No, I think, the only thing that I would say is when we think about sex positivity, just the fact that you and I are having this conversation. And what I would want to say to the people listening is, make sure that when you're getting information around sexuality, look at the people that are talking to you, look at the people that are listening, and not being afraid of this idea of rejection. I think, I've had, when I work with my guys, sometimes they're like, oh, I'm watching this guy on YouTube that's telling me exactly how to talk to women. Or like, no, you have to really, again, that connection, that attention that we've talked about. But I don't know if there's anything that we're missing. I think that we covered a lot. I think if I want to leave you with anything is going into your erotic garden, okay, family, culture, society, media, peers, and pick one message that has been really loud in your life that you want to grow away from, that you need to open some space for those exotic flowers, and that you want to just unplant or undo because it no longer serves you. I think that's really, if I could give people a little bit of like a home practice, that would be it.
I love that. From your experience, from your perspective, what are our collective next steps in creating a more sexually healthy society?
Yes. So I think, right, like we said, having these conversations, but I think understanding that human sexuality is so diverse, that it's so unique, that there's so many ways to express your sexuality, right? Like that we are no one to judge how somebody else likes to be touched as long as there's consent, right? And people are kind of thinking about pleasure and play, right? I think as a collective, we need to be able to accept the same thing that we've been talking about. And, of course, my dream, I don't know if we'll ever get here, is that we just have better sex education and understanding that sexual health is part of overall health, period. Right? This is such an important piece, right? This is sexual health is part of health, integral health, period. Well-being. That's what I would say.
So beautifully said. And thank you so, so much. But going back to that point, it is so true that sexual health is part of our health. Our sexuality is tied to our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health. So I love that you ended on that note, because I do think that in order for societies around the world to start taking sexual health more seriously, they need to really understand how much a part it is of every other system that has to do with our health.
Absolutely. 100%.
I have thoroughly enjoyed this interview with you.
Thank you,
So
Tom. Me
much.
too. You're welcome so much. Anytime. I'm always open, and I think my vision is to be able to provide this type of talk. So I'm so excited that you guys are doing this. Thank you so much for having me and for opening spaces for us to be able to talk about a topic that's just so important. There's such a need for good, fruitful, healthy education around this topic. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to have a voice.
Thank you.